Greetings. My name is Jason Punda. I am the Network Security Architect for Enterprise IT Solutions, and I am here to talk to you about the Palo Alto Best Practice Assessment. So, Palo Alto historically has always done a really good job of providing tools for non-Palo Alto customers. So, for example, you have the Security Lifecycle, the SLR, which is a great tool that's usually built around firewalls that are sitting there in existing environments that are not Palo Alto based, looking at traffic, observing patterns, application usage, malware scene, things of that nature, and creating a summary report that gets shinier every time I see it, that shows exactly what has been observed that was not necessarily caught by the existing infrastructure. For example, they also have the migration tool, which has long been a community-supported project that is a godsend if you are actually trying to take production configurations and migrate it to Palo Alto in a way that's going to minimize impact and downtime. But they've not really had a lot for existing Palo Alto customers that really is geared towards how they can better improve their security posture. So more recently, the development team at the Palo Alto has been trying to build out tools that are really geared towards taking customers who are already Palo Alto customers and helping them maximize their security posture and maximize their usage of the platform they've invested in. And one of these tools is the Best Practice Assessment. Now, the Best Practice Assessment, the first time I saw one was probably late summer, I think. And I was real excited when I first saw it because all of a sudden here I had something that took work I did manually and automated a lot of it in a very convenient pass-fail check type situation. So values that I had to keep in my head for how things were supposed to be set were now here in black and white with Palo Alto's intelligence gathered into it. Typically, we deal a lot with compliant environments, so typically security best practices for most of our customers is a hodgepodge between industry best practices, vendor best practices, and what's determined by whatever levels of compliance they have to meet. And that's always going to be the case, but this meant that this gave us a single snapshot for what the vendor best practices and industry best practices were going to be, so it made matching things up with compliance requirements a lot easier. And the first customer I met with, I'm walking them through this, and I'm showing them different things about their environment and heat maps and details for the rules and looking at things they passed on and things they failed on. And the guy I was working with, a real smart guy, very security-minded, I could tell that he understood the value of what I was walking him through. But at the same time, he obviously was not as excited with what I was showing him as I was. And it's something I thought about after the fact, and it sort of made sense. Because on one hand, here I'm coming in, and I'm showing him this list of things that's wrong in the environment, which always feels slightly bad, no matter how good you think your environment is, that someone's telling you, no, here's the things that are wrong. But also, I was giving him data, and it was good data. And I'm a big believer in data and the value of data. But it wasn't data he could immediately make use of. It's something he could use long term. He could take that back, get a hold of his network team, and get them to go through the checks that they failed to figure out what needed to be done to remediate it, or figure out if it was something that needed remediation at all. But it's something he's got to pull members away from their current projects to go work on. So even though it was good data, it wasn't actionable to him right off the bat. And that type of situation has sort of influenced how we handle things. So what we do is we take the BPA, and we definitely present the BPA, and we always make sure the customer has a BPA at the end of it. But we also come in and we try to provide some intelligence behind it to try to help the customers understand, here are things that are immediately useful to you. Here are things that are more, long-term remediation type stuff. And so we started building out basically summary documentation for customers that we turn around and we break into a top 10 list that we go through, and we try to assign values to it. So we're looking at what's the risk to the customer, how complex is it, how much effort's involved, to try to come with a weighted score of these are high remediation items, medium, and low items. The idea being that when we present this to a customer, yes, they have the full BPA they can turn around and match up to, but they should be able to take this top 10 list and immediately take action on it to greatly improve their security posture. So what we're going to do today is I'm actually going to walk us through two different customers. And these are actual real customers. Names, serial numbers, IPs, things of that nature have been changed to protect the innocent. But I've intentionally taken two customers that come from opposite ends of the spectrum. So customer A, the first one we'll be looking at, they're a long-term Palo Alto customer. They've had firewalls deployed for 4 or 5 years. They have multiple firewalls deployed. They're an actual international corporation. The second customer we're going to be looking at, they're a very new customer. They've had Palo Alto for about 3 months. They only have a pair of DMZ firewalls deployed, and they didn't get services either from the partner who's actually sold them the firewalls or from Palo Alto. They're actually staying up on their own. They're basically greenfielding it where things are running in parallel. They're slowly cutting traffic over to it. So each of these two customers found value in what we were presenting to them for different reasons. For customer A, it was less a matter of, are my firewalls deployed correctly? For them, it was more a matter of, where are the deviations in baselines between how we originally deployed this and how they are now, and what were best practices like when we originally deployed it compared to what they are now. And it was a very interactive conversation with them along those lines. They were also real happy to have an opportunity to talk to people where this wasn't a sales engagement. This was tech guys to tech guys. There's no money involved or anything of that nature, no statements of work. This is just, let's talk about your environment. And there's also not a tech case. This is not support. This is not an issue. This was just a chance to get, hey, I have this question. Hey, what have you seen? And get feedback, which they really liked. And for customer B, it was validation that we're doing this on our own. We've been through training. We think we know how things work. But you're actually able to come in and help us see, are we doing things right? If we're doing something wrong, we can nip it in the bud now and do things better. So what we typically do is we take the BPAs, we look at the values. We also tend to do is we get the actual support file and parse XML. There's certain things we've learned to look for. So, for example, for customer A, one of the very first things that caught our eye is firmware. This particular customer is running 7.1.10, which you can find over here, in the BPA itself. At the time that we were doing this analysis, 7.15 had just been released. So for them, they're 5 versions behind, and you can sort of see it here in the uptime that obviously they haven't been doing firmware updates recently. And, depending on what issues you may or may have, your configurations, I can certainly see situations where you may decide to stay on the older version because of a particular issue, particularly if Palo Alto support has said, hey, there's a bug that you are encountering. We recommend you wait to this version where it will be resolved. But for the most part, it's always going to be better to go ahead and install your current firmware updates. So our first recommendation to them was go ahead and install current updates. Customer risk is high in that you are having to reboot a firewall. You are having to evaluate whether your HA is set correctly, things of that nature. But it's not a lot of effort. It's not really a complex thing to install new firmware typically. So it's something that's immediately going to provide value to them. The second thing we took a look at, we were looking at Ssl Decryption. And this customer was actually really well and being ahead of the game in that they have Ssl Decryption configured. And that's awesome. I'd love to see customers doing SSL decryption, but we had some things that we recommended to them based on that. For example, they have a decryption profile, but there are a lot of values that should be set in here that are not correctly set. So, for example, they're not checking to see whether the ciphers that are used in the certificates they're actually man-in-the-middling are actually good best practice ciphers. A lot of them that are out there on the internet are still ciphers that have algorithms that are easily cracked or known not to be recommended anymore. They're not doing revocation checks to see whether a cert has been actually revoked before. They're not checking to see whether there's actual errors with the certs. They've actually expired, things of that nature. Which means that even though they're decrypting, if there's a problem with the website that they're actually trying to go to, it's not going to be very obvious to them here. And the other thing that goes in conjunction with that is that they're using the same trusted cert that's signed by their own internal CA for both their forward trust and forward untrust certificates. And this is functionally will work. The issue there is, at that point, if I'm an end user sitting in their environment and I go to a site that does not have a certificate that I should be trusting, either because of the certificate profile here, or it's because of the certificate signed by a CA that's not going to be in the Palo Alto's own root CAs. For example, there are some military sites that are perfectly legitimate sites that use, would basically be the military equivalent of a self-signed cert, where if you go to them, it's not going to be in the Palo Alto's trusted certs. It's not going to be in the browser's trusted certs, but it's not that the cert itself is invalid in any way from that perspective. You should get an error saying, hey, there's something odd with this cert. Are you sure you want to go through it? If you're not presenting a cert to the end user that will also pass the error into them, you're sort of taking the end user's ability to make an intelligent decision about whether they should go to that site away. And it's possible that may be a decision that is made through policy. We don't want users to ever see an error, for example, but typically it's not something you do intentionally. And then this was a case where it's not this is wrong, but guys, you should take a look at this. Was this done intentionally kind of thing? The next thing we took a look at when we took a look at their summary here is that we were looking at zone protection. So they do have zone protection set up on some stuff. So they have a profile here for internal zone protection. But once again, there are some settings that are missing here. And this is a good example of what the best practice can give to you, because it takes a little reading through it to parse it. But it tells you right here that it failed. Why did it fail? You need to enable this setting, and you should not enable that setting, things of that nature. So someone can take this and go step by step and pass their way through here. So that was the first problem with the zone protection, is that it didn't meet the best practice standards on its own. The second problem is when you came in here to their outbound, there is no zone protection, or their untrust rather, there is no zone protection applied at all. They're only protecting certain areas going into the certain parts of the firewall. So it's good that they have zone protection going. It needs further work. It needs some adjusting. So something that comes up, and it's different for every customer, but something we always tend to look at, we want to look at the heat map. So mostly when we're looking at this and working with customers, we're talking the actual best practice. How are things configured? How should they be configured? The heat maps are part of the best practice now, and they do a good job of giving a snapshot of where things are configured, how they're configured, and how that ranks against industry best practice for that industry. So, for example, if you're running this for a hospital and you're going to look at healthcare best practice, if you're looking, running this for a retail that has retail stores all throughout the U.S., and you're going to be looking at retail wholesale best practice and comparing the two. And it does make a difference. For example, because of HIPAA compliance and HIPAA requirements, if you look at Wildfire for healthcare, that tends to have a low adoption rate, which means it's normal for a hospital to have a low adoption rate for Wildfire. Whereas if you look at Wildfire for a retail, you tend to have a much higher % of adoption rate because they don't have the same data privacy requirements when it comes to a lot of what they can ship off, because retailers are looking more at the PII and the credit card data. A lot of times those are isolated systems that are running separate. Maybe they're running off of a cradle point or something of that nature, versus hospitals where data's passing through and it has all the HIPAA and the HIPAA requirements. So it's important to have that built into it. So for them, we looked at this, and they have some good stuff going. They actually have a high Wildfire. They have high spyware. Sinkholing is not so good. Vulnerability protection is good. Things like that. Now, that said, one of the things that's important, and it's one of the things that we really encourage customers going through this to look at, is why something may be low. For example, this customer over here, you took a look at URL filtering, for example, we come into the best practice, we go back to our heat maps, and we start looking at things. This particular customer has certain areas where they're not doing URL because it's between zones that do not have any website related stuff to it. So for example, they're not doing URL going from their inside to their DMZ because they're not running public web server. Well, they are running public web servers in their DMZ, but they're not running public accessible web servers from the inside to the DMZ, where they would actually care about trying to filter their own internal web servers. It doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily for to have URL filtering turned on there. Another one that's real common we'll see is customers that have a lot of guest networks and guest Wi-Fi. It's pretty common for customers that are offering guest Wi-Fi to not do a lot of filtering on it, or maybe not any filtering at all, depending on what their own internal policies and practices are. At the same time, I do know some customers that will turn it on in alert mode, so at least they have the visibility. Honestly, that really starts going deeper into your network topology. How are you doing traffic isolation? How are you doing NAC? As to whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. But it is fairly common for us to see like guest Wi-Fi won't have antivirus, anti-spyware. And it's not a security decision so much as it is a corporate policy decision. So the actual practice here may show odd numbers of adoption that actually do make sense based on the environment. We also looked at and we took a look at their dynamic updates. So the dynamic updates is definitely an area that we see slightly off whenever we run these. And that's not necessarily something misconfigured by the customer. The reality is, as time has changed and different firmware versions have come out, and on Palo Alto's side, as they have changed how they ingest files, the type of files they ingest, their own best practices for dynamic updates have changed in a lot of places. For example, you can get Wildfire updates now every minute if you really want to, if you're running an appropriate version of firmware. 4 years ago, that certainly wasn't the case. Likewise, configuration of files using Wildfire in terms of the size of the file, the number of files, and things of that nature have also changed and evolved. So typically what we see when we look at dynamic updates, and particularly Wildfire, is not so much that customers have misconfigured stuff, so much it is they now have more options available to them that they don't know to go back and adjust. So this is one that comes up fairly often. We dug deeper in with them on their URL. So they have URL filtering, but one thing that is coming through quite often is that there's some adjustment that needs to be done to best practice. So on one hand, I can take a look at this and I can see they've actually done a really good job of staying on top of categories. So for example, we have command and control. That is a fairly new category that Palo Alto has introduced just in the last few months. And there were a lot of emails that went out by Palo Alto telling people this, telling them to go through, adjust the block. But I still see a lot of customers that either they're not signed up for the security emails, or maybe the emails are going to someone who no longer works there, or someone who's no longer part of the team that administers the firewall. So it's fairly common to see that particular URL category that's not selected. Here I can see it has, but they still have some adjustment they can do. So for example, they have hacking as a continue category. They have questionable as a continue category. Best practice typically on these is going to go ahead and block those. Then if you have team members who actually have a legitimate business need to access those, so for example, you may have investigators in the SOC that legitimately need to go to sites that qualify as hacking, then that should be handled through user ID on an actual individual basis, either through the entire group or the actual specific individual themselves, versus making the category hacking across the board a continue category that anyone could click through. So there's some tweaking they would need to do here to adjust some things out. Nothing major. Like I said, they've done a really good job with this. And in general, this particular customer has done a really good job. You'll see there's not a lot that's really screwy with what they've got. So for them, again, it's just more of a tweaking, tweening, tuning type thing. Management interface is one I see a surprisingly large number of customers run into issues with this. So if we come over here and we look at our management interface, they don't have a IP access list on the management interface. Anyone who is on the network, who, assuming there's not controls further down the network stack that we don't see from a firewall perspective, they technically have access to that management interface. Now, they may not have an account for it, but it means they could potentially try denial of servicing it. Or, worst case scenario, if a hacker has managed to get in through malware that's on a USB drive, it gets onto an admin's machine and they get admin credentials, that's one level of protection that's missing, where they can try to attack the firewall, not from the admin machine, which might draw attention, but from a different machine off to the side, because there's no controls in place to limit who actually has access. So best practice here, your best practice is you should have your admins segmented anyways. That's just a general security best practice. You'll have those in here. And then depending on what you're using for logging and monitoring, so for example, if you're running SolarWinds, you may have that in there. If you have Nessus doing credentialed scans, you'll have that in there. So you build out your tools that need access along with your users and put that into the management interface, a permitted IP list, to control who actually has it. It's just another level of security that's always good to implement, and usually not a hard one to implement either. So we looked at system and configuration logs. So they have logs that are set here to be forwarded, but not for configuration or for system. So you think about log types and what's in place, and config is really one of the big ones. Most organizations are going to have either an internal security policy that requires tracking admin actions and possibly a compliance requirement. So, for example, if this customer had to adhere to, IRS Pub 1075, for example, for compliance, they would need to keep years' worth of logs for admin access to any box that processes IRS data, FTI data. So the fact they're not offloading that could be an issue compliance-wise, but it's also probably an issue for internal policy-wise. So this is one actually when we presented to them, I don't think they were actually aware they weren't actually exporting those logs off, because they do have logs going elsewhere. And then the last thing we were pointing out is that the way the things have set right now is logging is only going to Panorama. And I don't have it here in a best practice for us to take a look at, but Panorama itself is not logging anything. So it means that right now Panorama is where all their logs live. So should they lose that Panorama box, and there's a virtual box for their environment, then there's no place for logs to go. So again, going back to compliance, going back to requirements, integrity of data is usually a very critical thing. They lose the integrity of data if that box were to ever go down, because any additional logs that are created in that time period, are not going to actually be properly tracked. And should the box be completely blown away, then they've lost the record of those logs that were stored there. So it's important to have something else to log to, not necessarily from the firewall, but at least from Panorama. So that's something which they were fully aware of. They were actively implementing a SIM, which is where ultimately they'll go to. But that was really the last thing we had for them. So for our customer B, one thing you'll notice is there's going to be several things on here that we also saw on customer A. There's things that we find fairly common all the way throughout here. So this was sort of an interesting one, though. As I mentioned, they're new customers. They've only been running Palo Alto for a few months. So there's things in here that they're perfectly aware of the fact that they aren't doing yet. So this was not really a shocking thing for them for the most part. The value here for them was more in seeing that they've got things that are going along the right path. We did approach it from the idea that we were going to assume the firewalls were fully in production, fully in service, even though we knew that's not literally the case, because we didn't want to get into trying to guess what parts they've implemented. So for them, we went through here, and there's things that, it's going to be a while before they actually get to. But at the same time, even though this isn't initially a checklist of go fix this, this should help them with, now the firewall's up, it's operational, I have traffic going through it. What hit list should I have for features I need to enable that's going to get me the most value out of it immediately? So that was really more of our approach with them. So one of the first things we noticed was high availability, and this is something I actually have seen fairly often. So they do have high availability configured for their environment, and we can actually see it over here. There's some settings for high availability they could adjust based on best practice, having heartbeat backups, using encryption for high availability. And these are all good things to do, but that wasn't my immediate concern when I started looking through this. The bigger one is that they had enabled link and path monitoring, which is good. However, they hadn't actually configured any link monitoring groups or any path monitoring values. So just real quick, if you're not familiar with the Palo Alto HA, typically what you're going to do is if you turn HA on by itself, it's really looking at the HA interfaces and if the boxes are physically up. So if someone power cycles a box and HA is configured, it knows to make the other box active. That's step one. But step two normally is to configure either path monitoring or link monitoring. So link monitoring is basically looking at the actual data plane interfaces going into the box. Maybe there's one, maybe there's a dozen, depends on your setup. And then deciding whether you want to trigger a high availability failover based on what is observed with those data paths. So for example, you may have a port channel of 4 interfaces, and you may say, well, as long as most of those interfaces are up, they're just redundant connections going back to a dual homed core, I'm good, keep the active box the same. Or for example, I have one customer that pushes a huge amount of traffic. They have port channels, 10 gig interfaces. They can push almost more than the port channel can handle at certain burst times. So for them, high availability was even to the point of if a single link goes down, I want to fail firewalls over because I'd rather deal with a firewall failover than having more traffic trying to go through the port channel than I have interfaces that will accept it. But either way, it's all for monitoring the interfaces and making a determination to failover based on what's observed. The path monitoring, if you're an old school, route switch Cisco type guy, it's like the IP SLAs of old. It's looking at some place I should be able to reach reliably. As long as I can reach it, data paths are up. If I can't, they're not. Fail traffic over. And the goal for both is to make sure that even if management plane side is up, HA1, HA2, cool, awesome, but if data sides are having issues, to make sure failover is triggered. So that was something that they didn't quite understand. So they thought they had full HA monitoring their internet line in and their line out to their DMZ and so on and so forth. So this is something I actually know that afterwards they went and immediately made efforts to fix to make sure they had true high availability working correctly. The second one, they haven't done any Ssl decryption. And again, this was not a surprise. They knew perfectly well they hadn't done it. It's not step A for them, but it's something that they definitely want to take a look at. So we did talk a lot about the, how the PKI has to work for them to give them an idea where to start. Even though knowing perfectly well it's not something they're going to get to soon, it's definitely something we wanted to actually emphasize to them the value of it. I mean, every time I turn around and see a report on encrypted internet traffic, the amount that's encrypted is higher and higher and higher. So if you aren't decrypting traffic, you're not seeing the full picture. So it's definitely something they should be doing. And my advice to them was, before you kick all your users over, go ahead and start building that out. So as you start moving users over, you can actually test your decryption in a controlled fashion, because there's always things you're going to run into that you're going to have issues decrypting. So a real common one that I run into is cases where there are client-side certs and server-side certs, and it's mutually confirming each other. That's designed to prevent just the kind of man-in-the-middle attack that the firewall is essentially doing to decrypt that traffic. And there's ways you can work around it if you really want to, but typically this is such an isolated use case that it's easier just to exempt it out. But it's something you don't necessarily find if you haven't tested for it properly. So they should actually build the decryption out before all the users are over, instead of having to try to implement it after they're all going through it. We also looked at zone protection. Since these are live, they do have production traffic running through it, even though it's only a subset. We definitely highly encourage configure some zone protection, get them applied to their external zone so that they can, go ahead and get that value from the denial service and the port sweeps and everything else, reconnaissance attacks, all of that zone protection protects against, and get that going now. It'll take them a little while to configure it, and we actually did provide them with best practice values because that is one subset here from the best practice is if it's not configured, it can't actually fail. So whereas before you saw with the previous best practice we looked at, it gave the values that everything needed to be configured for. Here it doesn't have that, so we did provide that to them. Heat map, and again, this was absolutely no surprise. Their goal was to get the firewall in, get it in layer 4 first, start building things out. You can see they do have app ID adoption going up. So they've started kicking stuff over to layer 7. But again, it was for them in this case, it was less a matter of, hey guys, by the way, do you realize you're not doing this? But the idea is they can come back, we can run the best practice assessment for them again in 6 months, for example, and they'll be able to actually take this heat map here and the heat map from the best practice from 6 months from now, and they'll be able to actually see the progress they've made in implementing these advanced features, which can be handy for them in terms of just knowing where they're at, but it's also handy to go back to management who's worked with the IT staff and said, yes, we'll invest this money into Palo Alto as our firewall platform for the future, and be able to say, hey guys, in the 6 months we've had these running, this is the progress we've made doing all this next-gen firewall features. You can see we had nothing, which is what we had before because they had a layer 4 firewall of some kind, of ASA maybe, and here we're at now, we still have work to do, but we're at 75% on URL, we're at 90% on antivirus, or whatever it turns out to be. So it's a very convenient way for the actual technical guys to go to management and show progress they've made in enabling these advanced features. Dynamic updates, once again, and we pointed this out with the last one as well. They're not at where it needs to be. They're not getting antivirus at all. They do have Wildfire set correctly. Need to adjust the app and threats. So again, this does actually tell exactly what it should be. So they have the values to work off of. And again, because this is actually in production, even if it's not holding all the production data, it's important to go ahead and take care of it now. So one of the few things they do have coming off of here currently as part of the production, they have, like I said, a subset of traffic. They've passed through it. The biggest things for them is they've actually gone ahead and configured Global Protect. However, there are a variety of best practice settings for Global Protect that they need to take a look at. To be honest, it's a little messy. This is a lot to get through. And this is actually one where it's going to require some investigation on their side if they were to take this. So for example, GP portal satellite OSCP responder fails. Recommended to leverage a satellite OSCP responder. If you haven't actually dealt with VPN and Global Protect and PKI, and that may not mean anything to you. So this is not an easy one for them to immediately go, oh yeah, I can go click this box and fix. But it's definitely one they should be taking a look at as they build out their VPN deployment and trying to figure out, is this something we can turn on? If not, why are we not turning it on? Again, at least this way they have the best practice value for what it's going to be, but they're going to have to do a little research into it to determine whether it's something they actually can enable correctly for their environment. And it's not entirely built on how things are set up on the firewall. Some parts of this also tie into your global PKI environment and how you're handling certs and things of that nature. So it's definitely one of those, since they are using it for production traffic, they do have users coming through here and hitting it. It's high on the recommendation list for guys, you should go take a look at this, see what you can do with it. I mentioned this earlier with the Wildfire settings. This is one where there's very specific values for Wildfire that Palo Alto provides. In their case, they have some of them set correctly and some not. So we provide, here's the values to go back and tweak. This one's actually a fairly easy one to go through and adjust, because here are the settings, go change them kind of thing. Packet captures. Packet captures, you have to be careful how you're using them. And the thing I always caution with packet captures is that they're very handy. They're very handy for troubleshooting. They're wonderful troubleshooting. Most firewalls provide some way of doing packet capture for troubleshooting, but Palo Alto does have a good system I have found for using them that way. But they're also very useful for forensics and threat hunting and things of that nature. The caveat being that you have to have people that are actually going to take a look at that information. So there's no point in turning packet captures on every single log type from informational to critical if you're a two-man shop and you have no SOC and you have no actual security team. You're just taking up space on the firewall and not doing anything useful with it. So best practice, go take a look at where you have it turned on. Turn it on for your most high and critical threats. Turn it on for lower stuff if you have someone who's actually going to use that data. IP access lists. Again, this is just like it was with the customer. And again, this is a cool way of looking at it and going, well, here's a customer who's got 4 or 5 years under the belt and they have 8 or 9 firewalls, and here's one who's just doing this, and they both didn't understand the value of having this device management interface set up with an IP access list to control the management from an IP perspective. So just like with customer A, we explained that we talked through some use cases and scenarios, and in their case, there's definitely nothing further down their environment that would actually control that type of access. So once we had that conversation, they understood exactly why you would use it, and I'm sure we'll go forward and set it up. And then the last thing we looked at with them is just certificate level stuff. PKI is hard. PKI is foundational, though. So, we definitely want them to go through and, as they're building out stuff, make sure it's built around good PKI. So when they start doing decryption policies, for example, and they don't have any decryption yet, make sure they have the right cert profiles, make sure they're doing the right PKI chains or cert chains and everything in their system to build out that functionality, because it's one of those cases where it's much easier to deploy it correctly at the start than it would be to come back and fix it once it's deployed. So there you have it. 2 different customers, 2 different environments, best practices for both. And again, when we met with both these customers, we had great interactive conversations with them. We presented them the actual BPA file that we generate. We present them with an Excel checklist of here's the actual checks you failed. We also present them with that top 10 list. And having gone through this with customers prior to doing that and customers since we've been doing that, I can say that for every customer we've done it with since we started doing a ranked list like that, the feedback from the customers have been very, very good, because again, we're giving them actionable data they can work off of immediately. We're giving them weighted value. We've separated the wheat from the chaff there in terms of what they've got. At the same time, the best practice itself is giving them the more long-term goals. So there's stuff that comes up all the time in best practice. For example, syslog over UDP 514 triggers in every one. And that might be literally the last thing you fix in the BPA, but you have it there. You need to look for it. But at the same time, you have your quick fixes you can go ahead and implement right off the bat. So hopefully, by this point, you're really curious as how you go about getting one of these best practice assessments we've been talking about. And the answer is it's not actually very hard. There's a few things you're going to have to do. You're going to generate a support file on the firewall. You're going to generate a stats dump on the firewall. You're going to create a ticket with Palo Alto. You're going to upload these files to that ticket. You're going to alert your account manager. You're going to alert your sales engineer. And then they'll be able to actually generate things and send them off to you. So the first thing you want to do is you go to your firewall. You go over here to device and down to support to generate everything. If you're using Panorama to actually manage your firewalls, you're going to want to do this from Panorama, because that's where your configuration lives and breathes. At the same time, if you happen to have a special firewall that's different in your environment, or you have a firewall that's not managed through Panorama, or even your DMZ firewall, because your DMZ firewall is typically going to have a lot different configuration than a site firewall or a VPN firewall or a data center firewall. Go ahead and do that there as well. They can generate the BPAs on multiple firewalls, and if your person is having to go through and do the analysis on this, sometimes it's really helpful to have both sides of it to actually see and compare the two. You may find something that's more specific to just the DMZ, for example, that doesn't really apply across the entire environment. That's helpful to point out. So you're going to come over here, you're going to generate the stats dump, you're going to generate a tech support file. Stats dump is going to take 2 or 3 minutes. The tech support file is going to take, it could be 5 minutes, it could be 10. The stats dump is going to be used to create the SLR. The SLR is typically used for pre-sales, but it's actually really good to run on existing environments as well, because it gives you a nice snapshot of what type of traffic is going through your environment. How much video traffic do you have, and these are video applications, and how much social networking traffic do you have, and these are social networking applications, how much malware was seen, what URLs were visited, things of that nature. It can actually be really handy when you're handing it off to business leaders, people outside of IT. I remember one customer who actually took the SLR, and they were making the case that they needed to restrict their social networking traffic. And they weren't originally getting buy-in, but they took the SLR and they were able to show that their business relied very, very heavily on email. And in a single week, they generated 25 gigs of email. At the same week, they spent over 100 gigs of traffic on Facebook. So they're able to make the case that from a bandwidth and perspective and everything else, we are far heavier invested into users going to Facebook than we are into the email that makes our business work. At the same time, because the stats dump strips all the identifying information out, takes IPs out, objects, names, things of that nature, it's also something that's safe to share. That's why it gets used a lot in pre-sales, because there's not any identifying information in it that someone could take and use to actually compromise the system. So once you've got that generated, you're going to want to go to the support site, which of course is support.paloaltonetworks.com. You're going to sign in with your account, and then you're going to go to case management and open up a new case. And once you do, you're going to step through the case creation, and eventually you're going to end up with something similar to what I've got here. Make sure you have BPA and SLR somewhere in the subject and description. Give it a priority, select your type, put your contact information in. I'm not going to submit this through, but you can see the last step, once I did, would be I'd have the option to add attachments. And that's where you're going to take those stat dump and the tech support file that you generated and that you downloaded locally and upload them to the support case. So once you do that, all you need to do is email your account manager and your sales engineer, let them know, hey guys, I want to do a SLR and a BPA. I've already pulled the files, they're already uploaded, here's the support number, so they can take that and they can go generate the files. Incidentally, if you happen to be in North or South Carolina and you'd like some assistance with actually doing all this, or you'd like someone to actually help you create this top 10 list and review it with you that I've been presenting here, you're also perfectly welcome to copy us on that email you send to your Palo reps. The email you'll send it to is going to be bpa@EITS.com, and one of our engineers will reach out and work with you on it. So hopefully this has all been interesting. Hopefully you see the value of this. So again, I highly encourage you to go get these done and see where you stand.